Thank you all for coming out to Africana this afternoon, where we are beginning what we hope will be a season of reflection on the extraordinary life and legacy of Malcolm X, also known as El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, who left us exactly 60 years ago this afternoon, today. And for so many, that's hard to believe. But what we wanted to do beginning today is to create a safe space to reflect on and honor the legacy of a leader that he was, and in so many ways still is. My heart goes out to his family, friends, followers, and many, many students who are also in varying ways thinking about his life and his loss in this very hour all around the nation and the world, because he was, again, as I mentioned just earlier in our gathering, led by our library director, Kofi Akri, truly a world leader. The 21st of February has always been a challenging day for me in some ways since I was 11, because the morning of that day, my family lost my beloved great aunt, Janie Mae Jenkins Reese. And so for a long time in my life, I primarily associated that day with her loss, even before I knew about the history and legacy of Malcolm X. But once I learned about his legacy and history, it has always, it became a day of reflection that I would use to think about his contributions. And I think that even over all of those years, I just couldn't have imagined a moment like today. So I'm so thankful that we're here together and committed to thought on his contributions. But, you know, by the 2000s, it became more complicated for me when my grandmother had a medical emergency on the 21st and had to be rushed from rehab to the hospital. And so in so many ways, it's been that kind of knee-buckling day. And today, I think it feels that way all the more because of this commemoration. I've had a long journey with Malcolm X over the years, spanning back at least to when I was 13. I think like a lot of youth of my generation, encountered him as one of the figures whom we would learn about during Black History Week, then eventually Black History Month. And so I was exposed to his basic biography, but that was very much the point of entry for me to dig deeper. And so at age 13 at St. John the Baptist Catholic School, I did a project, a kind of twofold project, where on the one hand, I built a three-dimensional replica of his office as a project for Black history, and then wrote a research paper. And so from that point on, I was very invested in thinking about and studying Malcolm X's legacy. And then by age 17, as the editor of the Pirates Post at the historic St. Jude Educational Institute in Montgomery, Alabama. I wrote for the paper about Malcolm X and had a really, I think, challenging moment in that process when I'd written the word white supremacy at one point in one of the quotes, and we got the printed editions of the paper, and the word white had been removed. And so I, as a young person, just really got a sense of what censorship entails in that moment, and also of how incendiary and provocative the legacy of Malcolm X could conceivably be for some. The play by Robert Bolt, A Man for All Seasons, was a work that we were reading that year, and it was at that time that the concept of what it means to be that kind of person who is so committed to one's ideals that one is willing to literally sacrifice one's life for them was what I began to correlate with the majesty of Malcolm X from that point on as well. So alongside and with the legacy of Jesus, he came to embody for me a kind of man for all seasons in my own mind. And that was very much my thinking for a long time in college as an undergraduate, where I witnessed the popularization of Malcolm X's legacy. In many ways, the commercialization, the film by Spike Lee was released during that time, and so he was increasingly a subject of popular interest. But for me, in many ways, his legacy remained personal because of how profoundly it had impacted me as a girl and on the path into my womanhood and young adulthood. So I think that my experience and encounter with his legacy began to mature toward my undergraduate days when I first saw the documentary Make It Plain, and I valued that insightful perspective that it outlined on Malcolm X. Shortly after that, I read cover to cover the landmark edited volume in his own image, edited by Joe Wood, who was one of the earliest, I think, analysts to throw into relief Malcolm X's critical contributions, like in the decade of the 1990s and among a new generation of media figures. So James Baldwin's One Day When I Was Lost had been very valuable to me as an undergraduate. Dr. Kenneth B. Clark's interview. But adding a work like Joe Wood's to the mix, I think made all the difference in helping me to frame Malcolm X in a critical sense. And years after that, I was working on Malcolm X in earnest as a researcher when I was an assistant professor in the University of California at UC Davis, in the process of developing my first book. So essays like Robin D.G. Kelly's The Riddle of the Zoot were fascinating in particular. In fact, I always say that if I could give Malcolm X one thing to read about himself, it would probably be that essay, because I think he had a tendency to devalue and dismiss the early part of his life and to presume that it was, say, not radical, whereas I think that Professor Kelly does an excellent job of showing how all of the experiences, the forms of subversion in which he engaged as a young person were crucial steps on the path toward his radicalization. So I've suspected that Malcolm X would be very shocked to read that assessment. And so that's one reason that I tend to like it so much. And I've come to Malcolm X as an artist as well, in the new millennium, I think in ways that have taught me still more about how special he was. So there are so many things that I could say. I'm excited today, too, that at the Shabazz Awards in the city, there are multiple honorees who I feel are so deserving, including one of my dearest and most treasured friends from our undergraduate days at Morehouse and Spelman. This is the Reverend Lukata Mujambi, who is formerly known as Lawrence Jeffries, but that he's among the honorees, Mark Lamont Hill, and the daughter of Malcolm X, Ilyasa Shabazz. I think that the celebration there is just so special to hear about, and I just wish them well in that moment. I want to now turn to introduce our featured speaker for today, as well as our discussant, and then just pause for a moment to acknowledge one among so many special guests whom I think it will be just really valuable for us to hear from and inspiring. Jared Ball is a professor of communication and Africana studies at Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland, and author of The Myth of and Propaganda of Black Buying Power, as well as A Lie of Reinvention. Ball is also host of the podcast I Mix What I Like. He can be found at I Mix What I Like on most social media, and his decades of emancipatory journalism, media, writing, and political work can be found at imixwhatilike.org. And so I offer a heartfelt thanks to Professor Ball for taking the time to join us for this special commemoration today. And actually, that began yesterday in Telluride Hall. That's another thing that I think we should maybe reflect on, because the discussion there was just so meaningful yesterday evening. But welcome home, Professor Ball, to Africana. And this is a place that treasures your contributions as an alumnus, and also appreciates your contributions as a friend of Africana in the best possible sense. There's not been a time that I can think of over the years that I've asked him for favors here and there, and he's not delivered, from being a guest lecturer in my class back in 2016 when I was teaching a course on Black Panther Party autobiography, and he so graciously and generously shared the documentary project that he had developed on George Jackson, to clearing his calendar to come and join in the historic celebration of our founding director, Dr. James Turner, in 2019, the conference Making History. Margaret Washington is the Marie Underhill Null Professor of American History Emerita at Cornell University. She joined the Cornell University Department in 1988 as associate professor, specializing in African American history and culture, American women, and Southern history. Dedicated to bringing history to the public, Dr. Washington works with high schools, summer institutes, libraries, museums, archaeological sites, churches, businesses, assisted living centers, youth centers, New York State parks, recreation and historic preservation, the National Park Service, the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom, and the International African American Museum's Gala Geechee exhibit. Dr. Washington's board service includes New York State Humanities Council, the National Endowment for the Humanities Media Section, Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission, and John Brown Lives. Dr. Washington's media service as advisor, consultant, and interviewee for historical projects includes working on PBS, CNN, HBO, and the History Channel. Dr. Washington is currently writing Dine for the Oppressed, Women, Anti-Slavery, and Biracial Activism. Before we turn over the floor to our speaker, though, I want to, for a minute, just turn it over to Dean Janice Turner. The Turner family is ever the first family of the Africana Studies and Research Center, and the founding family. Without them, none of us would be here, and a day like this wouldn't even be possible. And so they've made so many sacrifices and generous contributions over the years. In studying the legacy of Professor Turner, alongside the experiences and perspectives of his wife, Dean Janice Turner, one of the intriguing details has been that they were literally friends of Malcolm X. And so on a day like this, and at a time like this, I really just want to take a moment and turn the floor over to Dean Turner to welcome and greet everyone and to share just some brief reflections, which we'll circle back to once we get to our general discussion.
Thank you. Briefly, James and I, when we dated, our special, when we had some money saved, we would go up to the mosque, to the restaurant on 116th Street. I was born in Harlem, but James was born in Brooklyn. So anyway, he and my mother and I, we would go and hear Malcolm. And then James decided that he wanted to go away to college. I was attending City College. And so our last night, we went up to the restaurant on 16th Street. And Malcolm was there, and he said, you know, I see you a lot here. You see you all. He said, you look alike, like brother and sister, but you're too close. So anyway, we told him where we were going the next day, because that was our night. And he went up and got the maps and showed us where we were going to Mount Pleasant, Michigan, which was about 70 miles north of Lansing, Michigan State. And he then wrote down his brother and his family's addresses and everything and said, anything go wrong, you just contact them. And we took 2 planes, and when we got to Lansing, I think it was his brother came and got us to the bus station to get to Mount Pleasant. And then James and he corresponded quite a bit. And I remember James and my brother hitchhiked, because Malcolm's family lived in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And they hitchhiked up there to go to hear him. It's on the day that he was assassinated, we were there. It was about 40 African Americans on campus out of about 2,000 students. And we all knew each other, and we had the apartment. We were the married couple. And so the young man that was from Grand Rapids came banging on our door and saying they killed him. And we thought it was one of the students, because we've been having trouble with the students on campus. So we would get together and talk about what we were going to do, and we went in groups. And then when he said it was Malcolm, I mean, it's almost like it's yesterday, and we just couldn't believe it. So he and James corresponded quite a bit, and he saw him when he went up to hear him speak. And it's just, I'm glad that Africana is doing this, but it's sad, and it's also, the reason I think it's sad in a way is that how far have we come? We're still going over the same things. And I say to the young people here, you know, you've got to get together and bring in your sisters and your brothers to understand what's going on, you know. We have not arrived. And Malcolm was a very gracious person. And he did love young people, and he did try to bring it, because the young people, y'all are the future. So that's brief, but it's sad. It's sad for me, but it's also a rejoicing that we are still honoring him, which he should be honored. And I believe he was aware that something would happen to him. Yeah, so, yeah. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So I'm going to, let me set my timer. I want to get to the discussion. But first of all, it's an honor to be here. Professor Richardson and others have since I've been here these last, couple, hours and days, a number of people have been thanking me. And it's very uncomfortable to be thanked to come and do something like this at Africana in commemoration of Malcolm X in front of Dean Turner with Professor Washington and so many other folks here. This is an honor. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank all of you. I don't need to be thanked, and clearing my schedule is an honor. I mean, the only time I didn't do it is when my daughter was graduating. At the time, there was an event here, and I couldn't make it, but the only reason I would not have been here for anything. So it's an honor to be back here. It was an honor to belatedly, I have to admit, realize how important it was and how fortunate it was to have gotten in here in the first place. And I was sharing last night, I got here early when I first showed up here in 1999, and I didn't know, I just really had no idea what was going on and what I had even been invited to. And I had been up here for like a week, and then I was just confused, and for some reason I just decided to call over here one day, and Dr. Turner happened to answer the phone. And I've never forgotten what he said. His exact words were, "Where have you been? We've been waiting for you." And the way he said it, I'm not even doing it justice, it conveyed the kind of import and weight that we would later learn from him was the mission of this place, and the ideas and the legacies that he wanted to transmit on to us to continue. So anyway, all that to say, it's an absolute honor to be here and to be able to participate and to be welcomed back. So thank you all very much. The Africana Studies and Research Center, obviously the Telluride discussions last night, I've really had a good time. That was really beautiful. Just quickly, my premise here for today, in general, with everything that I've ever wanted to contribute to discussing Malcolm X, was that he was assassinated physically and then routinely, posthumously, via image framing and an imposed popular cultural narrative, specifically to assist in the increasingly sophisticated nature of our colonization. I'm thinking a lot lately about some work I'm also late to, Professor Erica Edwards and her work around imperial grammars of blackness is exactly where I think we're seeing what is being done specifically to Malcolm, that he is being replaced in terms of framing and branding, and even in terms of popular discussions of civil rights and what black liberation is supposed to be by the appearance of black figures who are really ultimately there to support the imperial project of this country. More specifically, I'm also thinking of what Professor Orasami Burton has said recently about the liberal counterinsurgency, which is where I think really specifically all of what I have to say is situated in. And he said, that is, Burton said, that this liberal counterinsurgency is used, quote, used by the ruling class to stabilize imperial power by assimilating marginalized groups into positions of relative authority in the hopes that their ascendance will obscure the conditions of naked violence or even encourage people to want to advance within that structure and become an overseer. I'm reading I transcribed what he said during an interview we did recently. He said that off the top of his head. I was I gotta read it again. That is liberal counterinsurgency. That is the attempt of the state to perform a counterinsurgent act. That is, we are seen as insurgents. And even if you go back and look at the original press clippings of when Nat Turner rebelled, the press back in the day said Nat Turner and his insurgents. So black people and black rebellion has always been seen as an insurgent force. So the counterinsurgency in this country is used by the ruling elite to stabilize imperial power by assimilating marginalized groups into positions of relative authority in the hopes that their ascendance will obscure conditions of naked violence or even encourage people to want to advance within that structure and become an overseer. And the image, the framing that I would argue that we get of Malcolm, particularly in popular culture, sometimes academically, journalistically, is meant to serve that exact same purpose. When we saw in Kofi Kree's presentation a few minutes ago, Dr. John Henrik Clarke, I mean, he put it in the words of, these are the crumbs that we get to appease us. But the only thing wrong that it's uncomfortable for me to say this, but the only thing I disagree with that Dr. Clarke said in the clip we watched a little while ago was that he predicted in that interview in the 70s that we would do better at recognizing the fraudulent leadership imposed on us and see past the performance. And I think he missed that. I think we're in the exact opposite moment. And maybe we can come back to that in some of the discussion. And then I was also thinking in terms of Kofi's presentation a minute ago that we saw and discussed how Malcolm had been invited to Oxford because he had become sort of a global standard for black liberation and radical politics. And then more recently, we see Oxford is bringing the likes of Terrence Howard to tell us that 1 × 1 is 2, or something like that. And a very, I don't know, maybe you all didn't see it and good for you, but it was several major steps down politically from where we had ascended at one point with Malcolm being the spokesperson over there. So I went to the recent, I want to recenter the politics with which Malcolm worked and looked to advance, which would include radical nationalism, Pan-Africanism, anti-Zionism, anti-capitalism, anti-imperialism, pro-labor, pro-socialism, a pro-liberated African continent and diaspora as someone exemplifying the best of the black radical tradition, encompassing and expanding upon everything in that political alphabet from Garvey to guerrilla warfare, and that's just the letter G. A tribute to his internationalism is again, I think, also important. If for some of us, maybe I'm projecting in a myopic, undue focus, but there's been this push that I feel like is very much akin to a kind of liberal counterinsurgency or modern-day counterintelligence program that encourages black people to see their stakes as only being tied and wedded to the state, to this state, where we're wanting to be seen as foundational to a country that has been built on dividing the diaspora, and the diaspora from its labor, from its culture, from its resources, from the wealth it produces. So why would we want that? We know that just a couple of years ago, the British press reproduced a story reminding us, in the context of talking about Kwame Ture, that they were actively looking to suppress and disturb his ability to spread Pan-Africanism, because specifically he was saying it was done on the basis of scientific socialism and a liberated African continent. United States of Africa. And the British press was acknowledging that they had worked assiduously with this state to suppress that. So when you think about Malcolm's internationalism that preceded that and led and impacted Ture, you could see why not only the state would have targeted Malcolm, but posthumously wanted to target those ideas to get black people in this country back solely wedded to this country, this state, not to see themselves as having a destiny connected to the diaspora. I'm thinking also about, of course, it was mentioned earlier, I'm sorry, I skipped a part here, forgive me. Rest in peace to the recently passed Marika Sherwood, whose research on Malcolm is not often credited, but is one of the leading voices in reminding us of that internationalism. And even without her, I think, even meaning to, correcting some other scholarship that looked to read the same diaries and notes that she was reading, but divorce them and erase all the radical politics that she noted. And in fact, Sundiata Chajua, in our collection of essays in the back, points out the fact that Sherwood did a great job of using Malcolm's diaries to raise a critique of state surveillance and state intervention in ways that other scholars have ignored. Claiborne Carson obviously had done the same thing with the FBI in its surveillance of Malcolm. Don Rojas and Herb Boyd published their recent book on Malcolm and the CIA. And of course, their focus is on that internationalism and how Malcolm was part of an internationalist movement and a Pan-Africanist movement that could be traced and tracked back to Garvey, and was part of a panoply of African world activists and scholars and journalists who were attacked persistently for that internationalist focus and anti-imperialist focus. We know that we know he was a threat because the state documented it. We see what they've said about him in the counterintelligence program papers, that he was a martyr, that he was the standard by which others were being judged. In terms of his abuse, I would argue, in the press, there are at least 3 broad stages that I'll quickly summarize that I think reflect what has happened to him. Pre-assassination, Malcolm was a foil for Dr. King and what was seen as the preferred form of black resistance. He was then quickly discussed as having been worthy of death in the mainstream press after his assassination, based on his having been such an exceptional representative of the radicalism that they wanted to demean. And by now, Malcolm has become rebranded for those wanting to impose this liberal counterinsurgency as a method of appearing to give us our radical histories, but distilled to the point of appeasing only the liberal wing of the ruling elite. In fact, I need to credit him. Dr. Burton sent me something recently that speaks to this point, given his own research on that is Burton's research on the use of prisons to suppress radicalism. The Rand Corporation published a document not too long, well, let's see, actually I should have that pulled up here. The Rand Corporation, that bastion of radicalism and that font of left-wing thinking. Actually, I should have, where's the date on this? Oh my goodness, this is terrible. I'll come back and find the date. But the point I wanted to get at, they have a section on Malcolm. It's the document is called Radicalization or Rehabilitation, Understanding the Challenge of Extremist and Radicalized Prisoners. And the point of their exploration is to study, the impact of prisons on suppressing radicalism. And on their section on Malcolm, it's called Radical Prisoners Since 1945, and they start with Malcolm X and the Black Muslims, and point out that the life of Malcolm X is an excellent example of the potential for radicalization in the prison environment. But they're saying this in the context of this being something that they need to watch out for and manage and make sure it doesn't get replicated. And then if you go and read Tip of the Spear and other, Burton's, it all fits, and you can see all of the programs that they would have implemented. And then, one day I hope I can complement this by adding a little bit, because there's a parallel to the development of mass communications research here in the United States, the development of the prisons, mass communications research, and there's an overlap in terms of funding, study, psychological manipulation, warfare, all kinds of stuff going on. That's why I've called Burton's book actually my favorite book on the history of US mass communications research, even though it doesn't even intend to do that work. So part of the liberal counterinsurgency effort is to play itself out through, it also plays itself out through academia and popular culture. And in these cases, where I become most interested is in their depiction of the politics, the ideas, and the people and movements that came into being in these ways. So in other words, when I don't really feel animated until I start to see people start to seemingly intentionally rebrand all of these histories and politics to reduce their importance and to reduce their effectiveness on impacting young people. And I mentioned it last night. So in 2018, the Air Force was doing war games because they had studied and realized that Generation Z was not going to get what it had been raised to be promised to get, and they thought that Generation Z would rebel. And instead of advocating for redistribution, wealth, jobs, healthcare, they just said, you know, click, clack. We're just going to put the bombs together, the guns together, we get ready to go to war with our own citizens and engage in war games to practice going to. So in other words, the point is the oppression is going to continue. The goal then just has to be for the ruling elite to manage the ways people respond. They're not going to just give us, they're not doing the redistribution, they're not doing the end of the violence and the oppression and the surveillance. They're going to keep that up. So in predicting accurately that there will be rebellion, how can we best mitigate that? And one of the major tools is to, in advance, preempt any rebelliousness by laying a groundwork of certain narratives, framings, et cetera, and the suppression of radical politics. So much of the discussion in Netflix and Hulu documentaries and series regarding Malcolm does not actually engage the ideas with which he worked and he wanted to advance. The whole series on who killed Malcolm X, I think not one word was spent on why was he a threat? What was he doing? What did he want to do? What were his politics? What were his ideas? Why would anybody want to kill Malcolm? So I just want to talk briefly before I wrap up here about what I've come to have some fun with in my work called the Vernon philosophy of black media avoidance. The Vernon philosophy of black media avoidance is a semi-ironic homage to an old friend of mine with whom I used to deliver pizza, and an argument for a much-needed political clarity around an aggressive hostility toward popular culture and mass media. Simply, many years ago, a black friend and co-worker named Vernon said he would no longer go to any films which included black actors. Initially, I thought this was absurd, or at least an overcorrective response to a clear, long-standing, and well-documented problem of black media portrayal. I only needed a few decades in the accumulation of massive student loan debt to realize just how correct Vernon was and is. Given the ideological and political function of media that media play in this society, none more significantly here than in the United States, the Vernon philosophy argues that black people or any oppressed group must refuse acceptance of any and all popular, cultural, or symbolically, quote unquote, positive depictions. Said differently, the Vernon philosophy calls for an immaterial boycott of commercial pop cultural product as any seemingly redeemable content either isn't really or exists only to further confuse, weaken, or diminish the capacity for critical, radical, or countervailing thought. So the boycott is immaterial because the Vernon philosophy is not a particular political call to action and is specific only to the arena of dominant idea formation, public opinion, and analysis. The purpose is to overtly and aggressively challenge the tendency among us all to desire recognition from power and to see ourselves positively reflected by power and to focus more on assuming power, the only position from which to control popular dissemination of media, symbol, and image in the first place. So specific to Malcolm X, my point would be anytime we see a popular commercial media product, instead of getting excited and wanting to run and go see it and support it, we should become immediately critical. And even though we know we're going to engage it, we should engage it on the basis of as soon as we start to like it and feel moved by it, we should become even more critical and look at how they found a way to push our particular buttons. So again, applied to Malcolm, the Vernon philosophy cautions against our desire to see Malcolm depicted and his story told with how those stories consistently suit the narrative of empire by negatively depicting his self-defense as terrorist violence, suggesting that he would have supported liberalism in the Democratic Party, that he would have used his relationship to Islam to condemn so-called terrorists or advance the Western and Zionist projects, or that his attempts to advance Pan-Africanism, internationalism, anti-capitalism were immature. Conversely, there are attempts among among the black bourgeoisie and their parallels among so-called nationalists who attempt to capture Malcolm in moments where his arguments in support of black business are taken out of context or from earlier points in his political evolution in order to present black capitalism as revolutionary. That for me has become a major, major problem. There's been a lot of that going on. There's that clip of him in 1960 saying something about black people taking control of their businesses, and people take that and blow it up out of context and leave out all of his subsequent understanding of the critique of capitalism, which he said, if you show me a capitalist, I'll show you a bloodsucker. And then try to blow that up so that they can, sell us their products and claim to be advancing the legacy of Malcolm X. All right, so I'll close here by saying that Malcolm's final project was the Organization of Afro-American Unity, and I'm so very glad that it, of course, came up earlier today. This organization is almost shockingly under-discussed and discussed out of its frame in so many spaces, and yet its goals were to be the above-ground political organizing body that would encourage militant solidarity with the broader and diverse left, would produce public policy agendas and candidates, and as a mechanism for radical engagement with electoral politics. The OAAU would, as he said, as Malcolm said, put our religions, or the lack thereof, put those preferences in the closet so that we could focus on the material fight here in front of us on this day, in this hour, right now. It's too late. That was my favorite. That's one of my favorites. Right now, it's too late. Straight up. I'm sorry to get amped. My bad. I was like, ah. Yeah. And that our struggle here as in the United States, was but a piece of something much larger and much bigger and broader than any United States. One of a diaspora, one with African people, and again, in militant solidarity with people of all backgrounds the world over. And I want to stress that phrase, militant solidarity. Not some nonprofit thing, not some symbolic, I put your thumbnail on my Twitter account. No. Militant solidarity. Malcolm X had begun working with the OAAU to progress the treatment, involvement, and leadership of women. He had largely reseeded the standard of black and radical politics in this country and around the world. Again, one of my favorite, we talked about it last night when John Lewis wrote his memoir and talked about as the head of SNCC going around the African continent in 1964, following a path that Malcolm had laid, and he said, everywhere we went, every African leader told us, if you're anywhere to the right of Malcolm X, we don't want to talk to you. And if, I can't get over what that must have meant, to have an entire diaspora having Malcolm be the standard for a discussion of black politics here or anywhere else. It's almost incomprehensible to conceive of a world like that in 2025. Malcolm X had begun, right, so Malcolm had become a symbol worthy of the assault on his image, which continues to suffer and is meant concomitantly to be an assault on all of us. And by that I just simply mean that, in killing Malcolm, it was understood, as you read in the Counterintelligence Program documents, the idea was to make black people who want to be revolutionaries realize they'll be dead revolutionaries, as Hoover is quoted as saying. The goal, as the fifth tenet of the Counterintelligence Program says, that as it relates to black America, it says specifically to make sure black youth are disassociated from black radical politics. So we have to understand Malcolm's assassination beyond just the horrible moment of what took place on this day in 1965, but it's something that has meant to be a negative impact on the rest of us in 2025. And with that, I'll stop, and I look forward to having an engaged conversation, and as always, as Fred Hampton used to say, peace, only if you're willing to fight for it. And thank you all very, very much.
Y'all hear me? Well, thank you, Jared. There's a lot to unpack. I want to start with two situations having to do with Malcolm. Sort of exemplary. One having to do with the internationalism, and then the other one having to do with the book that you edited on Manning Marable's book. Sometime, I think probably in 1991, maybe 92, Alex Haley came to Cornell. to speak about Miles Davis, whom he had written about, and also and especially Malcolm X, because as you know, he edited, it was an as told to autobiography of Malcolm X. And it was a very, very interesting talk. Bailey Hall was packed. Afterwards, some of the students, I was a faculty fellow at the townhouses then, and some of the students who had arranged it said that Mr. Haley would go down, was willing to go down to, I think it was Telluride, and talk to a group of students personally after the talk, and did I want to come? Of course I did. And we went down there, it was probably about 11:30. At 5 a.m., his assistant came down and said, Mr. Haley, it's 5 o'clock. You have a 7 a.m. flight to catch, so you really have to end this. We spent most of that time talking about Malcolm X. One of the things he said that and this is where I want to ask you about, Jared. I asked him, I said, remember in the part of the autobiography where it's the end of the book and Malcolm is under duress. His house has been bombed, his children have been threatened, and he's very worried. But he goes to Haley and he says, he's been to the Middle East twice. He has spoken in Europe, not in France, but in England. He has established the OAU. He says that he wants to go to the UN to talk about Black internationalism, but especially about the treatment of Black people in America. And he tells Haley, according to Haley, I know the nation is after me, but the people who are after me are bigger than the nation. I know the fruit of Islam. I know them, and I was telling this to Haley, and he finished my words. He says, he knows them because he trained them. I said, yes, that's what and he said, oh, I said, that's what you wrote. He said, and that's what he said. He said that this was not the nation's doing. If it was, the nation was being used, that this was bigger than the Nation of Islam. This is an international conduit that is behind trying to get me killed. This comes out of Haley's mouth. So I want your response to that. And then my other question has to do with, there's been a plethora of books, as I'm sure you know, on Malcolm. One of which, besides Manning Marable's, also won a Pulitzer. I think it came out in 2024. I can't remember the name of the author, but it was, he and his daughter were writing it. He died, and she finished it. What's his name?
Les Payne.
Payne, yeah. Right, yeah. So there have been a plethora of books, but your volume, one of the points that was mentioned by one of the commentators was a comparison with William Styrum's Nat Turner's Rebellion. Nat Turner, in case you don't know, was an enslaved man who led the biggest slave rebellion in American history. Killed 50 or 60 whites, and he was, of course, found eventually and killed. And Nat Turner's rebellion, Nat Turner confessed. We know what happened because he left the words, the Nat Turner narrative. William Styron wrote a fictional account of Nat Turner's rebellion in which Nat Turner rebelled because he wanted a white woman, and he couldn't have her. And so this was why we had the Nat Turner rebellion. William Styron, a well-known Pulitzer Prize-winning fiction writer, this is his version of Nat Turner. It's wildly popular. It was even used in history classes at the University of California. Totally fiction. John Henry Clark and others, including Vincent Harding, wrote answer to Nat Turner. And one of the, Harding's I think was called, You've Taken My Nat and Gone. but it was basically a group of scholars, black scholars, critiquing Styron's impressionistic, fictionalized version of this black revolutionary, taking away his revolutionary ardor and making it all about a white woman. So, some people have compared the book that you edited with what Styron did with Nat Turner. And Manning Marable wrote the reinvention of Malcolm X, in which he said a number of things, which you're better able to speak to than I am. And you edited a book that was a collection of critiques of that. So, do you agree with the comparison of Nat Turner, and Manning Marable in terms of what you and your authors were doing? So that's my second.
No, I appreciate that. So I'll start there. So I do appreciate the comparison. If for no other reason, Paul Coates, when he called me to do this, he said that's what he wanted us to do. He literally said, I want us to create a 10 Black writers respond to William Styron version from Manning Marable. So that was part of the intent. And one of the few things I remember vividly from that original volume, I believe was written by John Oliver Killens, and his point, the point was that he was saying that Styron wanted to present a version of Nat Turner that would say, we could maybe understand some form of violent rebellion to enslavement 100 years ago. But we would want to make sure that, and he mentioned H. Rap Brown would not be justified today by reading William Styron's book. Like, that was supposed to be the point. And it's wild to say that and then to be reminded again that Jamil Al-Amin is still a political prisoner. So somebody in here is smart enough to make something, put the line, connect that in a way I'm not doing right now, but there's something deep with that. So that was what we did see, and as I said to you earlier, I've come to, over the years, refer to that book as a book attributed to Marable, as I've become less confident that he saw the final version of it. And the more I reflect on his previous work, wherever I might have had some kind of disagreement, this is such a break from his trajectory. So I just feel less comfortable calling it Marable's book, even though that isn't our title. And especially hearing the comments of Wendy Wolf as the publisher, I mean, the way she talked about the book and the way she talked about her involvement, kept saying we in the editing process, it just made me like, I was just like, I don't know. But that was the goal, to try to produce a Black Writers Respond. And to your first question, again, we heard it in the presentation Kofi shared with us earlier, when John Henrik Clarke made the point, and I like how he did that. He said, yeah, whatever you want to say about the Jews killing Jesus, you have to first start with the fact that they were under the colonization of the Romans, who created, so when you want to talk about, well, what role did the nation have in killing Malcolm, it has to be understood in the context of the colonization of this state and its preferred involvement, its preference. And I remember even Vanderwall and Churchill, the way they describe it in their book on the counterintelligence program papers, they describe Malcolm's assassination. They say of Malcolm's assassination that the state, the way they frame the state's summary of it, is as that the state took credit, like the government was saying, yeah, the nation may have pulled the trigger, but this was, like, we kind of set this in motion. And I do think that has been my bias frame. I am looking forward to Zach Condo's updated book on his conspiracies, where in our last conversation he suggested that actually that there's less evidence that the state was directly involved, and that bothers my bias, but I wait to see that work. But I do, yeah, that is mine. I think it's best to understand that even if there is no overt so-called smoking gun that shows the state's involvement, it's clear that they wanted it. It's clear that they preferred it. It's clear that from the way the press talked about him, the way the intelligence community talked about him, the way that he was under so much surveillance, and the goals of the state project needed Malcolm to be removed, if for no other reason, to make sure, again, in 2025, we're stuck with the kind of leadership we have today.
And then when you consider his worldwide recognition,
Yeah.
I mean, going to the Middle East, his realization that what they practiced as Islam was not really Islam, and that kind of break, although there's some work that indicates that he was already suspicious of what was going on.
You mean within the nation?
Yeah, with the nation. So that was interesting to me that this was a factor. The other thing is, besides his international acclaim, he had also made peace with the civil rights movement. I found this amazing poster of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King meeting in an airport. And I actually bought it. I had it framed. I have it in my office at home. It's a great big poster. They're meeting, they're shaking hands, and they have the biggest, most genuine smiles on their face. And when you consider that both of them were assassinated, that Martin Luther King had moved from civil rights to social justice, socioeconomic justice, and when you consider the sense that Malcolm thought that this was bigger than the FBI, in addition to when Clay Carson compiled the book Malcolm X and the FBI and all the files, he says that the FBI began to have a surveillance on Malcolm X the minute he stepped out of prison. And that was like 1953 or 52. So I think, to get back to Haley's point, was that Malcolm thought that it was the FBI that was after him, that it was bigger than the nation, and that in some ways the nation was sort of the ruse.
Well, I mean, you mentioned it already. I mean, as he said, how could the nation have stopped him from getting into France? How could the nation have provided the nation wouldn't have been having a variety of both black and white surveillance and undercover agents following him, as Rojas and Boyd point out in their book. Like, the nation couldn't have done that.
Yeah.
So there had to have been, and again, their own documents. I mean, when the FBI calls him a martyr for a black radical movement, it's understood that the state is terrified of not only him and his own ability to do work, but what reverberating impact that would have. And again, even as you just mentioned his visit to the Middle East, could we even imagine 2023 having a leader? First of all, the world wouldn't even be this way if Malcolm had not been assassinated. But just for a second, what is the response after the Al-Aqsa flood when media want reaction from people if Malcolm is here? Like, what analysis would we have gotten as opposed to what we were encouraged and are encouraged in terms of understanding even that event? Anyway, I'm sorry. It was just a.
Let's talk about Manning's book for a bit, because I think some of the responses are very interesting. And let's take, for example, Henry Louis Gates. Manning Marable has written the definitive biography of this outrageously misrepresented figure. He has plumbed through countless historical records to bring out to bring out not what there is, but what there isn't imagined. And Carl Evans, who also wrote a book called The Judas Factor, The Plot to Kill Malcolm, called the book an abomination, an innuendo, illogical fallacy, and reinvented from previous works on the subject. The Root, which is published, Henry Louis Gates is the editor of, refused to publish the review, and then Gates says he has nothing to do with that. But that review was basically silenced. And would you talk about what you think people object to most in Manning Marable's book?
Oh, there was a lot. I mean, there were so many things. I mean, and I was talking a little bit about this last night. I want to be honest when I say this. I recognize where I am in this world of academia when I say what I'm saying. Like, I am not the most prolific scholar. I am not there are levels to this. But just the scholarship alone in that book was terrible. The citation, in my own essay, I talk about the truncation of statements to literally rebrand what he was saying about voting, the erasure of again, all of the radical politics, at the beginning, and again, this is not about a critique of the LGBTQ community, but it's to say that at the beginning, he is, by innuendo, said to be a homosexual, and that by page 400, it's just listed as an attribute.
Yeah.
Black, male, gay, blah, blah. And it's like, well, wait a minute, how do we, and I was just looking at it again this morning in our book, Sundiata Chajuwa, because I wanted to say something about Marika Sherwood. He points out that in her work, Sherwood uses the diaries of Malcolm to show how he met with Lynn Shiflett. She leaves at 11 o'clock. Malcolm goes to take a walk because he's lonely, and that's the end of the discussion. In Marable's book, this same encounter with the same body of evidence is recounted as they spent the night together.
Yeah.
And it's how in the world could this, and I gotta say, so I and some colleagues tried to engage folks involved with that book from the beginning. I reached out to what was said to be Marable's research team, which featured Zahir Ali, and there was nothing but hostile evasion. And there was a sister that was working at the time at Al Jazeera in DC who surreptitiously, unbeknownst to all of us, put us on a panel together. She said, so I knew, my colleague Dr. Burroughs knew Zahir Ali would be there, but she did not tell him that we would be there, and did not tell us that he didn't know we would be there. We had the interview on Riz Khan's show. It went well, and after the interview, and again, I have to say, I have no evidence. I cannot prove what I'm about to say. But after the interview, we're waiting outside, and I said to Zahir, basically I was saying, this is all it would be. It would just be a discussion of the book and the work and some of our criticism. You don't have to try to, you don't have to be afraid to come on my radio show. I'll give you the questions in advance. You can take it to your team. You can all have weeks to review and come back with your answers. And he first said, honestly, I didn't have as much to do with the book. So then I was saying, so why are you happily touting it and promoting it as and his exact word to me was, well, I'm building my own brand.
Wow.
And I'm sorry I don't have any evidence for this. So do with it what you will. But I'm most disturbed by my own response because I was dumbfounded, and he just got in the car and drove away. But to me, the idea that anyone would be wanting to build their brand off of Malcolm X speaks to what is being done by an industry. So again, similar to what I'm saying about what Clark said about Pontius Pilate and Jesus, and what we're saying about the state versus the nation, I would say about this. Whatever I'm critical of with Zahir Ali's comments or Marable's attributed volume, the problem is the bigger structure of publishing, of platforming, of funding, of framing. When the book comes out, as you already noted, the praise is everywhere. Yeah. And then people aren't reading the 600-page book. People aren't delving into it. And so the amount of people who are going to read the book, the amount of people who are going to be aware enough to assess what they're reading, and then the amount of people who have all of that and then be willing to say something publicly critical is very, very small. So it's that much easier to suppress any of the criticism. And then my biggest problem is that the people who were promoting and attached to this work and the disciples of Marable are now repositioned to be the next. Peniel Joseph told me, again, I can't prove this because he said it to me on a phone call where he said he did not want to go public with this, but he said to me, I want to be the next Henry Louis Gates. Wow. And this was in the context of me raising criticism about his work, and I'm saying, and then if you watch, I know I'm going too long with this, but two things quickly. If you watch Henry Louis Gates, did any of you see him on Stephen Colbert's show promoting his last book? You should all watch that. He said to Colbert, the reason I wrote this book is because when I was at Yale, which of course he had to remind everybody, he said, I was being bullied by the Kwame Ture's and the Stokeleys, he wouldn't have said Ture. But I was being bullied and being told how to be black and who to date and what to wear and what to do. And I wanted to write a book so that students aren't coming to campuses today wouldn't feel that they had to succumb to that pressure. And the other thing he said in a discussion with Peniel Joseph about Joseph's, I think, equally bad book about Stokely called Stokely, A Life, he says to him, I worked with you on this book from the very beginning, so I've seen it since it was in its galley stages. And he then starts going through and counting the pages. You see him on camera counting the pages. He says, how could a book about someone supposedly so important consist of 250 pages up until 1966, and then everything from 66 to his death has only 30 pages? What kind of man would be worthy of? And my point in all that is to say that the structure has assured that people who are most prominently placed to tell us about these people and histories are people who don't like these people, and they don't like these histories, and they don't want these histories to be remembered or become inspirational. And and as Peniel said himself, I want to be the father of Black Power studies.
Robin Kelly calls him the self-appointed monarch of Black studies.
But he also
self-appointed.
Well, my favorite was when Bob Brown, Kwame Ture's former comrade, said, well, if you, Peniel, are the father of Black Power studies, who's the mother? But the other thing, oh wait, it just went out of my head. You just referenced, what did you just say? Who quoted who again?
Peniel Joseph. Robin Kelly?
No, Robin Kelly. So, again, one of my brilliant scholar, no question. But he did also call Peniel our premier interpreter of Black Power. And I wrote to him and I asked him about it, and he was gracious. And Gerald Horne said something similar of praise about Peniel Joseph. And and I worry about that because these are brilliant scholars who I think know better and should be positioned to raise more of the important critiques. And then I would also just want to say, since we're here, I don't think criticism or disagreement should lead to hostility. It doesn't have to mean we have to be enemies. We just don't agree on what we did in that moment. And I think there needs to be more of a willingness to discuss and be disagreeable publicly for the good of the community. It doesn't, that's it.
Well, Herb Boyd said he found 25, I found this very interesting, 25 significant, absolutely egregious errors in Manning's book. I was kind of blown away by his gender characterizations. I thought they were very offensive. I thought the way he presented Betty was demeaning. And what was interesting is that Russell Rickford, who's our colleague here at Cornell, he was a graduate student with Manning, and most of the material, apparently, that Manning had on Shabazz, he didn't use because Russell wrote a fabulous book on Betty Shabazz. But there was plenty of information about Betty that is not in Manning Marable's book. Instead, she is I mean, basically what he says, you can correct me if I'm wrong, you know it better than I do, but she was, you know, sort of chosen for Malcolm by the nation. That, you know, they said, well, this is, you know, she's a nurse, she's young, and, you know, you want to marry, first of all, you want to marry a woman with a profession, you want to marry a woman who's 10 or 12 years younger than you. They gave him all these stipulations, and that's why he ended up with Betty. And it was a very unhappy relationship. Now, this is in the book, which is a different characterization of Betty Shabazz in the autobiography. In the autobiography, it's transitional, right? Because, especially on gender, because Malcolm at sort of middle of the book, when he's married, and he's basically not disparaging of women, but he definitely sees them as, well, the best example is that women, when you're in a car with people in the nation, the women sit in the back and the men sit in the front. So you are second class. And I asked someone about that, a Muslim about that, and he said, that's a sign of respect. And I said, well, I'd like to be respected by your side, not behind you. And which didn't go over very well. But that was sort of the way Malcolm spoke about women in general at sort of the beginning of the book or after he got married. And you can see his attitude changing as you go through the autobiography, especially as his relationship with the nation deteriorates. He becomes closer and closer. Frankly, I think the autobiography of Malcolm X is beautifully written. But Haley is if you've ever read Roots, you know what a great writer he is. But you can see the transition and his emotions coming into play as he becomes more and more conflicted in his own politics, that he's relying more and more on his relationship with his wife, until at the end, he's talking about how much he loves her in the autobiography. So for me to have read that years earlier and then to sit down and read what Manning, and you know, Manning I considered a friend, to read what he wrote, I mean, I was just outraged by it. That there was just so little respect for her. So when Russell, who applied for the job at Cornell in the history department, when I read his book, which I didn't even know about, it was so uplifting just to see the way he treated these sources that he found that was part of the trove of information that Manning Marable gathered but didn't use. And he said, you know, to his graduate student here, you can use this. And so he wrote a book, and I don't know if the book has gotten very much recognition, but it is Betty Shabazz is the name of it. It's a very good book. But it's just this difference in the treatment of this woman that really turned me off. And there's a British journal did a critique similar to what you edited that I wrote an article in, and that's one of the things that I focused on, was the gender aspect of a life of reinvention that I just found very offensive.
So for me, like, so some of the responses to our effort that we got were that we were simply being defensive of someone we didn't want to hear any criticism of. And personally, my reaction was, let's say, for instance, my issue was not with what the conclusions, but how the conclusions were being reached. Mm-hmm. So if in fact someone does the research and there's evidence to suggest Malcolm had some flaws here or there, fine. But it's the way, and I think, and I look forward to reading Professor Rickford's book on this, because similar to what I was saying about Marika Sherwood, the same pool of evidence is being framed and interpreted very differently. And that's my bigger problem than what the actual conclusions were. And for me, you know, what I do remember most, because I remember the way I read big books like that, is I will often read the intro and then the conclusion and then go back. Because I just want to see, what are you trying to say and what are you concluding? And when I read the epilogue, when you talk about how angry, I was furious. And that's what made me go back and read the book multiple times intently, because the epilogue, he's concluding wild things in this
Yeah.
epilogue about
Yeah,
Malcolm
that's
would
right.
have supported a critique. He would have been the first to condemn the 9/11 terrorist attacks as, you know, an Al-Qaeda, and he would, it was just this, now he's a liberal Democrat now. And then, you know, and Peniel literally wrote the same in the book, saying you know, basically Obama is Malcolm. You know, like you know, it's like, you know, he's an extension of. And I remember saying to Peniel when he first showed me the cover, I said, wait a minute. So the purpose of your book is not to show us the distinction between Obama and Malcolm? Like, that's the only purpose that should be. Like, it shouldn't be to show one as an extension of it. Should be there's a distinction. Even if you like Obama, you should at least be able to recognize the political differences between him and the Malcolm X and just look at them clearly and say, well, this is why I still like Obama for his time. But you can't to say that one is emanating from, I mean, it was just so. But anyway, so that was what did
And
it for me.
Marable was
yeah.
was a socialist.
And that's what I'm saying. The more I think about it, I really don't believe he was fully capable with his illness and the condition at the end to see the condition of that final book. I'm very suspicious.
It came out
I don't
after
know.
he died.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
There's one video, I remember, there was one promotional video right before he passed where they show him holding up a copy of the book.
Yeah, it's a promotion.
And I remember him, and I was looking at that video like, man, he could barely even hold it up,
Yeah.
much less read it and see clearly what had been done through the editing. So if anything, I haven't said anything about this publicly. I'll say it now because I haven't only been thinking about it over the last really year or two, is that, looking back, I now wish we would have had some wording to that in our title. Instead of correcting Manning Marable's Malcolm, maybe correcting the book attributed to Manning Marable.
Yeah.
Because I really do think that this has become, again, to that previous point, the bigger problem. This is a collective monstrosity. This was not one person making a bad book. This was an apparatus coming together to say, we need something. As they said, they said it, we want to replace the autobiography in its importance. And I agree with what others have said, with all the flaws of the autobiography, and there are plenty. I do agree, though, that for those of us who read it at a certain age, it made us want to be revolutionaries.
Yeah, it was.
For all of its flaws, it made us
eye-opening.
want to go to another level. And you read Marable's book was much longer, much more comprehensive, and it's like, and you read the epilogue, and it's like, Malcolm was great. I'm gonna go vote for Kamala and be like, I'm a revolutionary. And it's like, or worse, I'm gonna see Kendrick Lamar's Super Bowl performance. It's a revolutionary act. It's like, wow, Malcolm said himself, we don't use the word revolution if you don't know what it means. You don't know what it means. Like, we need to, but that is a result of a liberal counterinsurgent process that has turned successive generations into thinking, oh, this is great, we're advancing. And they had to kill Malcolm first and then assassinate his character and image every year since.
Yeah, the idea was to degrade him. But I've used Manning Marable's work, the Second Reconstruction. It's wonderful work.
How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America, I love that too, actually.
Yeah. W.B. Du Bois, Radical Democrat.
Yeah. And all those souls, like Dr. Burroughs, one of the things I like that he did for his contribution to our book was that he talked about, he went back and read all of Marable Soul's journal stuff. And the only thing I don't think he completed was the assessment to prove that there's a departure in this book. But he was leading us in that direction with what he was saying in the coda. That if you read, again, we don't always have to.
Kept looking for it, yeah.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
So what are we supposed to think of Malcolm today? What is Malcolm's legacy? How is he viewed? And in terms of what we get with Manning, what we get from some of these other writers, all the way up until 2024, there are just scores of books on Malcolm.
Yeah, so I said, this came up in our discussion last night, but I think that one of the things that has happened is that it's something that Kwame Ture once said about Malcolm, that nowhere in the African world could anyone get get up and publicly disparage Malcolm X and get away with it. No matter what your true politics are, everybody's going to publicly, and so and I believe that that's still the case. Symbolically, it's sort of viscerally understood, this is an unassailable icon. The problem, though, however, is that when the next level of questions is asked, well, what does it mean that he is this unassailable icon and symbol? That's where this issue of rebranding becomes an issue for me, and people can either just sort of have, again, some unconscious reaction to seeing his face or his name, but then fill in the gaps with all of the non-proper, all the inappropriate interpretations of Malcolm, or all the other false interpretations of what it should be to be a radical and a revolutionary. So that, there was a moment of tension where I had to answer Paul Coates' email, because, Paul is the father of Ta-Nehisi. And Ta-Nehisi Coates had written an essay about Malcolm where he said something similar to what Peniel was saying, something like, I saw Obama get elected and I looked at my poster of Malcolm and was like, salute, like it was one of those kinds of things, And I had to write Paul and say, that's not where we're going with that.
Right?
But that kind of thing, like, and obviously, Coates is no idiot and he's a brilliant writer, but I felt like in that moment he had fallen prey to what has been the design here, to fill in those missing gaps with something non-Malcolm. So Malcolm should be, that's what I was trying to say tonight, Malcolm should be remembered for the ideas he actually tried to work with, and then those ideas should be, we need to find ways to incorporate them into the work we're doing today. And just try to remember it. This is what he was trying to do, and then hopefully, to the extent we agree with it, try to revive that in our own organizations, which we should be more members of and supportive of.
Well, if we talk about biography, and I kind of ask this as a biographer because I think about what I was trying to do with my biography of Sojourner Truth, and that is to give the reader a sense of what America was in the eyes of Sojourner Truth. And I mean, other people can say whether or not I did that. Frankly, I think I did. But
did you? No, let me ask you though. When you were writing that, were you conscious, or how conscious were you of a desire to have young, maybe particularly black women, read this and pick up a certain? Were you overtly aware that you were trying to? Like, I want people to read this and want to become a new wave of Sojourner, or like, was there,
No, as I said this on a podcast a few days ago, I was trying to give voice to Sojourner Truth and look at the world as she may have seen it.
Okay.
So that was my goal in terms of trying to recreate her life and the world she knew as she lived it. What do you think a biographer should do? If we think about Malcolm, for example, and it's in a way it's different from an autobiography, right?
Yeah. I don't. So first of all, I'm not. And I think Professor Richardson made a great point at lunch earlier that biographers deserve their own special category. I think there's a good point there, and I don't even feel qualified to answer that question. So I'm going to answer my own question. I would like to see, again, more encouragement. I don't know if biographers should or can do this or if it's appropriate, but my hope or what I would want is that for people to create biographies that interpret these people and histories in ways that would make readers want to do it, to do it again, or to do another version of it. I'm probably messing this up, but Ryland Rabaka said something years ago about trying to distinguish between approaches to Africana theory and the struggle against Black history becoming just a repository, I think was the word he used, of stories. and actual something that encourages us to get busy, in my own language. And that's what I want when I read a biography, when I read anything. I want to finish it and be humbled that I'm not radical enough. I want to be called myself names. I want to be, I want to be feeling like I did just a minute. I want to feel like I need to rip the podium up. That's what I want. I don't know if it's appropriate to put that on a biographer, but I admit that's what I want. And I've also admitted it, and I think it's a shortcoming, I think it's a flaw in my writing is that I have not read enough fiction and poetry. And I think it's so obvious that like Fanon, you could tell he read poetry. It was not just, But I also haven't been as much interested in people's biographies beyond their politics. So I admit, even when I read a biography, I'm almost skimming. I want to, what did they think? What did they do? And I admit, I'm saying it's a flaw, because I think we should have a better understanding of all that went into making these people and movements. But anyway, that's just what I want. So that's what I'm looking for. But I don't know. That's a good question. What do you think?
Well, I think about something that Sojourner Truth said that a newspaper article picked up. And she was in Kansas, and this is toward the end of her life, and she was involved in the Kansas movement because African Americans, after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, were being lynched, burned, and raped. And so there was all this land out there in the West, which was Kansas, that's the Kansas area, and so she was in a movement to try and get black people to move west. And the Kansas City Journal wrote an article about her, and he finished it, and he said, "You say you wish to leave the world a little better than you found it, and history will record your having done so." And so that's what I think I tried to do with her life, because I think that's what she did. She saw the world was all messed up and said, let me see what little bit I can do, and spent her life doing that. And I think you can say that about Malcolm. The question is, do biographers present him in that way, or is that their intention? I don't think that was Manning's intention. I'm not sure what his intention was.
I don't know. I don't know.
But again, as you suggest, that he didn't really get to make those final decisions, then that's even a worse tragedy, because that means the publisher made them, and we know what they want, money. And he had probably gotten, I know he got a big advance. I don't know how much it was, but I was told it was huge. So they wanted to make their money. And, you win the Pulitzer by how much you have been advanced for the books. And so, it's quite political. It was set up that way.
That makes sense. That definitely makes sense. One thing that I've also often regretted about the timing of his passing is that again, I think of this book, Marable, I think, demonstrated a willingness to engage his audience. So I think he would have made himself available to discuss his book in spaces like this, and he would have, which is also why I think he didn't see the final version, because he would have wanted to make sure it was better as he prepared to engage his community. But I think he would have been willing to do that, and we would have had a much more fruit-bearing post-publication of the book than we ended up getting.
Yeah, perhaps the tragedy is that he didn't get to make those final decisions, because he was gravely ill. We can be generous and say someone probably made them for him.
Oh, yeah. But similarly, I mean, again, something similar is what happens with Malcolm, where Malcolm's assassination prevents him from fully appreciating and seeing the final version of his autobiography,
Yep.
and maybe having it be interpreted even more or better than it was.
He might have
or,
changed
he might have
things. No,
changed some things.
No, I don't want to say this.
Well, in fact, because I was just reminded the other day, it's been so long since I've read the autobiography, that the OAAU is not mentioned. It's not discussed in it.
That's right.
So that for sure would have been, we would
right,
hope,
it's
something he would have wanted to address, given that that was his last political project. And it's conspicuously absent from the book. That is supposed to be his lasting document. And then, which is another reason for concern for how it's discussed in Marable's book, which is said to be the replacement of the autobiography. And it's not discussed in any way that would encourage people to see the OAAU as something we should be recreating now with the proper, Pan-African approach, approach to electoral politics, women in leadership, et cetera. I mean, all of those things are things we still need today. So a better interpretation of that is still, needed and important.
Kofi?
Yeah.
With Manning Marable's book, I remember him promoting, as he was writing it, on Amy Goodman's Democracy Now!
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things he said, that he had two of the so-called missing chapters of the autobiography of Malcolm X. I don't know if that was actually true. I don't know what's up with that. Was that true?
Wasn't that was the lawyer in Detroit?
Gregory Reed.
Yeah, when Manning was on the program for the Association for the Study of African American Life and History about maybe 2 years before the book came out, and he was going to reveal something, and so the house was packed. It was in the biggest auditorium. Maybe it was in Atlanta. And everybody who was at Asala was in that room to hear what Manning had to say. And basically, Manning said nothing because he hadn't gotten this material yet. But he said, this is a chapter I haven't written because I haven't gotten the source. And the source is in Detroit, and it's a lawyer. And I've met with him once. I'm going to meet with him again. When I met with him the first time, he didn't give me the chapter or the information that I was going to base this chapter on. But what he originally said that got everybody at the convention in that room was that he had the material, when in fact he didn't. But he was creating anticipation. And he got it, because everybody wanted to know. And then the next year he became very, very ill. But he continued to write. So we don't know who wrote the last part of it.
Can I just add very quick, because I've always understood it to be 3 chapters, one on economics, one on Christianity, and one on nationalism. And like Professor Washington was saying, like for a long time we were hearing about this, and everywhere people were like buzz. And it never happened, as you just heard. But I had one. Gregory Reed has a chapter in the Third World Press book of criticisms of Marable's book that is, again, you could please read it and judge for yourself. Don't take my word for it. It's not very helpful. But I had a conversation with him around the time of the publication of that book, and again, he wouldn't let me record it, wouldn't go public with it. And the long story short was, it was this very confusing, vague set of responses to my very pointed questions about why can't we get copies of it published. I told him, I said, I will put a team together of scholars who will, for free, edit, transcribe, we'll do everything that needs to be done and give all of the money and the credit to you and whoever. It was like, we just gotta have this stuff out. It's gotta be out. And I kept getting these answers about, we can't let the white man have it and the white institution. And I was like, but if it's published, we all have it. Like, what is it was so frustrating. And I do wish there was and I remember there was some discussions in some movement spaces of of having the movement address itself to this man and say, you owe us, like you can't be sitting on this and not,
Yeah, right.
and I think we should. I don't know why. Yeah, anyway, so yeah. What's up, man?
Thank you, Jared, and thank you, Professor Washington. It's a very rich discussion. And I have to say that as a Manning student, one of the Manning students, and as one of the researchers who worked on the Malcolm X project several years before the biography came out, I appreciate Jared's acknowledgement that the book is in many ways a departure from Manning, the brother we knew, and from his body of work, right? Because, Manning, and you must also understand, that book came out, I think he had died days before that book came out. So his students were in mourning, right? And it was a really, it was a very, very intense time. We were struggling to come to terms with his premature death. You know, the brother had, so he had sarcoidosis, which is what took Bernie Mac, right? And trying to make sense, right? Sorry, trying to make sense of the book. I did want to, and I wanted to disguise my comment in the form of a question, so let me try and do a better job of that. I wanted to mention a very brief encounter that Malcolm had with Lorraine Hansberry. Lorraine Hansberry, the great playwright and leftist activist and internationalist. And, you know, Malcolm had apparently been talking about Lorraine. I think Lorraine had a white partner, and Malcolm has said some things about that publicly, and they met face to face, and Lorraine said, you know, Malcolm, appreciate a lot of things you say, but I have some beef about what you have said about me and what you have said about other members of our community who may have white partners. And she said, you know, you can't cast this out of the family, et cetera, et cetera. She kind of dressed him down. And Malcolm said, you're right, I'm sorry. So I always tell that anecdote about Malcolm because the impulse to humanize Malcolm is not necessarily a nefarious or a sinister or a conservative impulse. I think he becomes more radical when we start to understand that he's just as flawed as all of us. And I also say that because it's important to understand that, you know, great people and great men and leaders who can make tremendous contributions also make mistakes. I say all that in the context of Manning's book. I will say that Manning, as far as I know, and I have a good deal of evidence that Manning wrote that book. The only argument I ever had with Manning was about that book. And it was early in the writing, and you know, the Malcolm X project was very separate from the book in many respects. It was early in the writing, and at that point I was still seeing chapters and drafts, and I can tell you how early it was because the chapter we were discussing was the March on Washington chapter, 1963. And I went to, this is my advisor, this is my mentor, this is the man who brought me to socialism. I went to his office and I said, Dr. Marable, because I only started calling him Manning after he died. I said, Dr. Marable, I don't agree with this chapter. Because in that chapter, he paints Manning, he paints Malcolm as a kind of interloper at the March on Washington. In other words, the March on Washington reflects the mainstream, and the leadership of the March on Washington reflects the mainstream of black politics, and Malcolm is kind of a gadfly. And I said, this is just not the case, right? Like this is a dilution. And we had word, and we didn't resolve it. Like, he went off, I went off, I was mad, he was mad. So there's no question that Manning had a kind of a political project in that, or a personal project, or all of the above in that book that didn't reflect what the Manning that we knew loved Malcolm. He loved the brother. He started out as a Martin guy. You know, he always said he was the first person at Martin's funeral, but he became a Malcolmite. The book doesn't reflect that, and to this day, I can't take it off the shelf. I don't know what to do with it. You know, a few years after his death, I thought, okay, I've mourned, take the book off the shelf, and I put it back up. I can't, you know, it's a mystery. And what I would say is that I think if we call the brother's name in this space, you know, a space that he occupied, and you know, Black Studies was in his heart and in his blood. We have to also acknowledge the contributions of the brother's career and his life, right? As has been already acknowledged, how capitalism underdeveloped Black America, which made me a socialist, right? Race reform and rebellion. Still, the greatest synthesis of, you know, the modern Black freedom struggle post-World War II. Great wells of democracy, et cetera, et cetera. So I would say to the young folks and to the students in the audience, read Maryland. Read Maryland. As people all over the world have, and as many, many prisoners have, speaking of political prisoners, many, many prisoners, deep significance for prison, and understand his oeuvre, and I think we have to grapple with that as part of his legacy. And the last thing I'll say very briefly, I'm sorry I talked so long, is that I wanted to say one more thing about Malcolm, which is that when Malcolm was walking up Lenox Avenue, the winos and the drug addicts in the gutter would pull themselves to their feet because they would not permit Malcolm to pass them by lying down, right? And so, you know, I think this is to Jared's point about the nature of Black leadership today, right? I'm a Black middle class guy. Everything that I am as a man is because of Malcolm. But I recognize that Malcolm is a man of the grassroots. He belongs to the grassroots. He belongs to the most marginalized. He belongs to the people, not the privileged, not the elites. You know, I think that we can celebrate him and we can appreciate him, but Malcolm belongs to the most oppressed, right? And frankly, 99.9% of the Black middle class in Malcolm's day, speaking of streets, when Malcolm came down the street, they would cross to the other side of the street.
Yeah.
They would cross to the other side of the street. So I think that is inexorably part of the legacy of Malcolm. Sorry.
No, I appreciate you. Yeah,
That was
thank you
very
for
good.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other comments?
Just one, Amanda?
Hi, good evening. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I wanted to take up a point that Professor Washington made about the sort of gender dynamics of Marabou's biography and actually other depictions of Malcolm X as well. The other person, I don't know if someone said this already because I was out of the room, but the other person missing actually is his mother, Louise Langdon, Louise Little. And in the Les Payne, Tamara Payne biography, The Dead Are Rising, we find out that Marcus Garvey is coming to their house to see her. She is writing for Garvey's publication, and she's at the heart of Garvey's movement. Louise is born in Grenada. It's the island I work on for my PhD, so I'm quite interested in that. And she's also influenced by what's happening in the Caribbean at the time. So T.A. Marisho, who's the grandfather of West Indian Federation, is influencing her politics as well before she even gets to North America. So there's a kind of deeper political connection into the Caribbean that contributes to Malcolm X's politics. I have a question, and the question is, so one of the sort of controversies that comes out of Marable's book, and interestingly enough, Payne takes this up as well, and actually provides some sort of like evidence documentation letters, is about X's supposed same-sex relations. So my question is, what if Malcolm X did some male-for-male play?
Do you want to?
No.
My answer was always the same. I don't care. That's not. It's the same. And I admitted this, and this is perhaps a flaw, because I have a similar response when people say, "Well, Dr. King cheated on his dissertation and cheated on his wife," but that's not why he was surveilled, and that's not why he was assassinated, and that's ultimately all I care about. So, and I admit it's a flaw, it's a limitation, it's what it is. But Malcolm, you know. Man, I've had, honestly, being a grassroots radio host for a long time, honestly, I've had a lot of people tell me a lot of things off the record about Malcolm that are unsubstantiated, a lot of things. And this is one of them. And I've never cared. What the hell does that have to do with what he said when he wrote, when he spoke, what he advocated, when he tried to align? And the state did not assassinate him because he was gay. They did not assassinate King because he was cheating on his wife. So yes, these are things we may need to discover or come to grips with, I don't know, but it's irrelevant. And then to the point about Marable's book, my point is, if he was gay, the evidence is not demonstrated for it. So again, it starts with the reference to the talcum powder, which is a story that someone else is saying, and then at the end of the book, he's just listed as a homosexual. That to me is the bigger problem than what is the conclusion. So honestly, I don't even care. I could not care less.
I think it's also a question of evidence, and there's no evidence of either one of those assertions. They're just sort of thrown out, and you can do that in a book, but historians are not supposed to do that. And, you know, this is a historical treatment. And it's titillating information that may or may not be true. But again, you know, I agree that that's not why we remember Malcolm. That's not why we remember Martin. That's not why we remember Frederick Douglass. Because believe it or not, they have the same rumors about Frederick Douglass and the English woman who helped him edit the North Star. So.
Listen, before we wrap, can I just say again how much I appreciate this and this invitation and this discussion and everything. So thank everybody for everything. This has been
Well, welcome home.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, I don't know. Greg, I don't know.
This is crazy because, like I told you earlier, you sort of raised me in some ways intellectually.
Now that's crazy and almost dangerous. Do better.
And I know, and this is even crazy to say to your face, but I don't think that the way you have summed up Malcolm's and/or Dr. King's limitations, if they exist, or whatever their performances was, is a limitation. I think that the reality should come down to what are the political realities by which we judge each other. I don't think, this is the kind of conversation that I have had when people have asked me about all sorts of salacious things. Let's throw out one everybody knows, like R. Kelly. I asked somebody, I said, it was funny, I was with a relative, and I told somebody, I said, the same people who say they won't listen to R. Kelly will watch the Baltimore Ravens. And they said,
Wow.
well, what you mean? I said, well, who was Edgar Allan Poe married to?
Wow, that's deep.
13-year-old cousin? But he get a football team.
Oh wow, that's deep.
Y'all got on purpose. You ain't stepping in the name of love. I don't understand.
Wow.
A bit of a contradiction, right? I think that the reality by which we should judge each other should be, who are we at a material reality as we relate to one another versus what our imperfections are. Because if we
So I appreciate, I think, the broader point you're making. I don't know if I could agree with the examples. For instance, because, for instance, accusing someone of being a homosexual and accusing someone of misconduct with underage girls.
No, I'm not trying to.
Yeah. I'm just saying, yeah, I just want to make sure. Yeah. Yeah.
It would be one thing if Manny Marable said, here is the evidence that Malcolm X had this sort of life.
Right.
We should be able to wrestle with the facts of anyone's life.
True.
But being able to just assert things based on assertion and hearsay, because everybody in here, we've all been texting about something that we didn't do. But I think the reality is, do we make political analyses that allow us to challenge hegemony, or do we just have a popularity contest? Because the reality is, the U.S. government would not have cared whether or not Martin Luther King Jr. was a faithful husband if he was not a threat to the U.S. nation state. Malcolm X's sexuality would not have mattered unless he was a threat to the U.S. nation state. So why do we have a political analysis of people in our own community that the U.S. nation state doesn't have? And I think that that's a weird thing, is that when the power structure is judging you by your political line, and then people judge you by your subjective behavior, that seems strange. And I feel like that's kind of a counter-revolutionary perspective to have.
As long as we're not saying R. Kelly was targeted because he was a threat to the nation state. No, I'll just play it.
Well, thank you very much.
No, thank
This has been
everybody.
stimulating.